Hi, everybody, and welcome to the webinar, Safety and Efficacy of COVID-19 Vaccines in the Dialysis Population. I'm Alan Kleiger, a nephrologist in New Haven, Connecticut, and chair of ASN's Nephrologists Transforming Dialysis Safety. Along with Dr. Jeff Silversweig, I co-chair ASN's COVID-19 response team. This webinar is being presented by a partnership of kidney community organizations, including the AAKP, the AKF, ANNA, ASN, the CDC, the NANT, the NKF, the RHA, formerly known by everybody as the NRAA, and the RPA. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all to today's presentation, in which a panel of experts will discuss what we do know and what we don't know about the COVID-19 vaccines as they apply to the dialysis population. Following those presentations, we will invite our expert panel to join in a roundtable discussion based on the questions which you, the audience, submitted during the registration process. The roundtable will be monitored by Dr. Jeff Silversweig, who, in addition to serving as the Chief Medical Officer of Rogosin Institute, is the co-chair of ASN's COVID-19 response team and the Emergency Partnership Initiative. If you have additional questions to pose to our panel, please submit your questions via the question and answer section in your attendee control panel, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. Handouts, including the slides for today's webinar, will be available both during the webinar and on the ASN's COVID-19 web page. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the ASN COVID-19 web page this week. Two caveats before we begin. First, our knowledge about COVID-19 continues to evolve, so we'll share advice and experience. However, please keep in mind that the answers we have now will certainly continue to develop and to change. The second is that in some areas, we will clearly need to make clinical decisions even when the knowledge base is sparse. While our panel of experts may express their individual opinions, please remember that these represent personal opinions only and are not positions or advice from the sponsoring organizations. I want to just talk about some of the questions that people have raised about these vaccines in dialysis patients that we've heard in the community. First, is it safe for dialysis patients to receive this vaccine? And how do we know whether it's safe or not? The second is, will dialysis patients mount a vigorous antibody response? Will the vaccine protect dialysis patients with possibly suppressed immune systems as well as the vaccine protects other people? What should we be telling our patients about the facts we know and the facts that we don't know? What can we do to help patients and staff feel comfortable with this vaccine? And then finally, where exactly in the priority list do our patients fall? And what can we do to assure they get the vaccine as soon as is reasonably possible? Okay, well, let's get going. It's my pleasure first to introduce Dr. Kathleen Dooling. Dr. Dooling is the CDC co-lead for the COVID-19 work group of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, or ACIP, and really one of our country's leading experts. Dr. Dooling.
Sorry about that. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I'll begin the presentation. I have no disclosures. So the objectives for my talk today will be to go over the vaccine recommendations, both for Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine as well as Moderna COVID-19 vaccine, to talk about the clinical considerations for their use and with special attention to anaphylaxis. Next, go on to the allocation recommendations that the ACIP made and CDC endorsed, and then some of those considerations for implementation, and finally a summary and what's on the horizon over the next few months. So I'm going to pause here, and I think others may elaborate on what I'm about to say, but this is a basic description of how these mRNA, messenger RNA vaccines work. So via intramuscular injection, you're injecting a mRNA that encodes the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus that's packaged within what we're calling a lipid nanoparticle. And that's a conglomeration of several different types of lipids that I'll mention later in the presentation. Those dispersed into the intramuscular area of the deltoid are then taken up by antigen-presenting cells. Once the mRNA is in the cytoplasm, they use the same cellular machinery to be transcribed that any mRNA would. And as you can see in this graphic, the spike protein is then expressed on the cell surface. At that point, other partners in your immune system come together to recognize, such as the B cells, T cells, both CD8 and CD4, to recognize those antigens that are expressed on the antigen-presenting cell as they normally would. By the time this is happening, it's usually in the germinal centers, and the closest ones being the axillary lymph nodes here. It's important to note that the mRNA can either interact or integrate into the DNA of the cells. So there have been two publications of the ACIP recommendations for use of the COVID-19 vaccines. The first one that was authorized by the FDA under emergency use authorization was the Pfizer BioNTech that occurred on December 12th was the ACIP and CDC recommendation, and then the Moderna one recommended on December 19th. Those are linked there, and you can find the full recommendations at that location. So in brief, there are two mRNA vaccines authorized for emergency use. I've mentioned them both. Both products demonstrate vaccine efficacy of more than 90%, and that was consistent throughout subgroups, either by age, racial or ethnic makeup, or underlying medical conditions such as obesity, diabetes, etc. The vaccine safety profile of both products was found to be acceptable. There were some small, there were indications where there was an imbalance between the vaccine group and the placebo group, such as Bell's palsy. The FDA identified that even in the vaccinated group, the incidence that was observed in the trials was still within the expected range of the population. And it was noted in phase 3 trials that local and systemic reactogenicity was fairly common, and that was even more pronounced after the second dose and in younger adults. So in terms of dosing and administration, persons should not be prospectively scheduled to come back for their second dose persons should not be prospectively scheduled to receive their second dose earlier than recommended. And what's recommended is 3 weeks for the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine and 4 weeks for the Moderna. There is a grace period of 4 days that if a vaccine is received earlier than or equal to 4 days before the recommended date, those are considered valid, but that should be the exception rather than the rule. There is also minimal intervals between the COVID vaccine and any other vaccine that you may be given, such as influenza or tetanus, for example. And we recommend that a 14-day interval is maintained between COVID vaccine and any other type of vaccine. So for persons who have a history of SARS-CoV-2 infection, either they had full COVID infection that was diagnosed, or they come up as antibody positive, even if they may not have had a clinically severe infection, vaccinations should still be offered to those persons, regardless of their prior history of symptomatic or asymptomatic infection with the virus. The data from clinical trials suggests that vaccine is safe even in persons who had antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. Virologic or serologic testing to see if you had infection in the past is not recommended. It's not necessary before making a decision to vaccinate. So you may be asking, well, what about persons with a current SARS-CoV-2 infection? So if a person currently has COVID, vaccine should be deferred until after the recovery from their acute illness. And essentially all criteria should be met for them to discontinue isolation. There's no minimal interval between infection and vaccination. However, it should be noted that the current evidence suggests that reinfection is uncommon, certainly in the 90 days after initial infection, and thus persons who have had a recent infection could potentially wait 90 days until the end of that period if they so desire. Persons with a known SARS-CoV-2 exposure, so if you became exposed to somebody who had an active infection, what you do then in terms of vaccination kind of depends on what your situation is. If you're residing in the community in a regular household alone or with your family, and you've been exposed, you should defer vaccination until your quarantine period has ended to avoid exposing healthcare personnel at the vaccination site. Now, if you are a resident of a congregate healthcare setting, such as a long-term care facility, those folks may be vaccinated, as that would likely result in additional likely result in additional exposures because the healthcare personnel are already in close contact with the people who live there in the most cases. If for persons who reside in a congregate setting, such as a correctional facility or a homeless shelter, those individuals can still be vaccinated even if there was a potential exposure to avoid delays and missed opportunities. Persons with underlying medical conditions may be administered vaccine as long as they have no additional contraindications to vaccine. And we'll get to what those might be later. Clinical trials demonstrate similar vaccine and safety and efficacy profiles in persons with underlying medical conditions, including those that place them at increased risk of severe COVID-19 infection compared to persons without those comorbidities. For immunocompromised persons, so apart from a small number of persons who were HIV positive included in the trials, other immunocompromising conditions, including persons who take immunosuppressive medications or therapies, we certainly know that they are at increased risk for severe COVID-19 disease, but data are not currently available to establish the safety or efficacy of vaccine in those groups. They weren't ultimately included in the clinical trials. These individuals may still receive COVID-19 vaccine unless they are otherwise contraindicated. So those individuals should be counseled about the unknown vaccine safety and efficacy profiles in immunocompromised persons, the potential for reduced immune response in those persons, and the need to continue and follow all current guidance to protect themselves from COVID-19, even if they do receive vaccination. Excuse me. So for pregnant women are another group that are clearly of high importance and were not included in the phase 3 clinical trials. In fact, the phase 3 trials had most persons of childbearing potential actually have a negative pregnancy test before being enrolled in the trial. And we do know that we know some things about COVID-19 and pregnancy. There is an increased risk of severe illness, including ICU admission, mechanical ventilation, and death for women who are pregnant and then contract SARS-CoV-2. There might be an increased risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes, such as preterm birth. There are limited data on safety of COVID-19 vaccines in pregnant women. There's limited animal development and reproductive toxicity, also known as DART studies. But there are studies in humans that are ongoing and more are planned. So if a woman is part of a group, for example, healthcare personnel who are otherwise recommended to receive COVID-19 because they're at high risk of exposure, and the person happens to be pregnant, she may choose to be vaccinated. If you or someone you are caring for as a healthcare provider are considering vaccination in a pregnant woman, these are some things to consider. First, the level of COVID-19 that's circulating in the community and the risk of transmission or acquisition in the community, the personal risk of contracting COVID-19, either by the occupation or other activities the person's engaged in, the risk of COVID-19 to her and the potential risks to the fetus, the efficacy of the vaccine. Again, more information will be coming about that in the context of pregnancy, the known side effects of the vaccine in non-pregnant person, and then the lack of data about the vaccine during pregnancy. In terms of post-vaccination symptoms, there's certainly a lot we do know about reactogenicity, or the symptoms that are a harbinger that the immune system is reacting to the vaccine. So before vaccination, providers should counsel vaccine recipients about the expected local and systemic post-vaccine symptoms. Depending on the vaccine product, the age of the recipient, and the dose, either number 1 or 2, you can counsel on the following: that 80 to 89% of clinical trial participants reported at least one local reaction. The common ones were pain or swelling at the injection site, or swollen lymph nodes on the same side as the vaccinated arm. Approximately 55 to 83% of clinical trial participants reported at least one systemic reaction, common ones being fever, fatigue, muscle aches, headache, and chills. Now, most of those were mild to moderate in severity. They usually occurred within the first 3 days, in fact, most of them coming on within a day or two, and they tended to resolve in 1 to 2 days from their onset, and most self-resolved. The most frequent and severe reactions were following the second dose and among younger adult age recipients. So there are a number of considerations when those expected reactions do occur post-vaccination, and that can be difficult to navigate, for example, for healthcare personnel or persons who live in a long-term care facility. There are a number of documents that can help you sort through and triage those symptoms to make sure that you're taking the potential that it could be actually a COVID infection and not just expected reactogenicity, that you're sorting through those appropriately. So now let's move on to contraindications and precautions. So the contraindications to mRNA COVID vaccination are the following. A severe allergic reaction, including anaphylaxis after a previous dose of an mRNA vaccine and its components. So in other words, if you had an anaphylaxis or a severe allergic reaction after your first dose of Pfizer vaccine, you would then be contraindicated. You shouldn't receive either the Pfizer or the Moderna second dose. Another contraindication is an immediate allergic reaction or severity to a previous dose or any of its components, such as PEG or polyethylene glycol. Also, another component of the vaccine, if you knew you were allergic to any of the other ingredients like polysorbate, that would also be a contraindication to receiving either of the mRNA vaccines. Now, not quite at the level of a contraindication, but a precaution would be an immediate allergic reaction to any of the other vaccine or injectable therapy, an intramuscular, intravenous, or a subcutaneous vaccines or therapies not related to a component of the mRNA vaccines or polysorbate. So if you ever had another immediate allergic reaction to, say, influenza vaccine, another vaccine, or injectable contrast dye, etc. So another precaution is risks of developing severe allergic reaction. Something to think about is the unknown risks of developing severe allergic reactions should be balanced against the benefits of vaccination and really taken on a case-by-case basis. If you're concerned that there's a history of severe allergy, those patients can be potentially deferred for vaccination or consulted an allergy immunologist to be considered how they might proceed. So this is a list of the ingredients. Both of the mRNA vaccines have mRNA, of course. They also contain lipids, that lipid nanoparticle that covers them and protects that mRNA so it can get into the cell, and then a number of salts and sugars and buffers to stabilize the entire thing. I won't go through the list, but you can see here that polyethylene glycol, or PEG, as well as polysorbate are on the list. Now, at vaccination clinics, do please know yourselves and let your patients know that they will be expected to be observed for 15 minutes if they don't have any concerning thing in their history that they could be a person at risk for an allergic reaction. But all of those precautions that I told you about would put a person at increased risk of an allergic reaction or anaphylaxis, and those persons are expected to wait 30 minutes following vaccination for observation. Again, there are a number of tools that can be used by vaccination clinics to sort through the contraindications and precautions and really triage people into whether they should be waiting 15 or 30 minutes for observation. Another important thing to keep in mind is what a vaccination site needs to have on hand to be able to successfully manage a case of anaphylaxis should it happen. At the bare minimum that should be available at all sites performing vaccination would be epinephrine in a pre-filled or auto-injectable syringe, a H1 antihistamine, blood pressure cuffs, stethoscope, and a device to time pulse would all be necessary. On the right-hand side is a more enhanced list that you would expect to have at a site where persons with an actual history of anaphylaxis would be vaccinated. And in terms of key messages for preparing for a potential management of anaphylaxis at a COVID vaccination site, really important are early recognition of anaphylaxis symptoms, so making sure all your personnel know what those are, prompt treatment with epinephrine, and then activation of emergency medical services. So there was a report published in the MMWR yesterday that highlighted what we know about anaphylaxis in persons receiving the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. Again, the source for this is at the bottom. But ultimately, the cases of anaphylaxis have been monitored for and adjudicated during the period December 14th to December 23rd, really the first couple of weeks of the Pfizer campaign. Over that period, 21 confirmed cases of anaphylaxis occurred in the U.S., and that was on about doses administered of about 1.89 million, giving roughly 11.1 cases of anaphylaxis per million doses administered. In terms of those 21 confirmed cases, 17 cases were observed in persons with a documented history of allergies or allergic reactions, 7 of whom have actually had a history of anaphylaxis. The median interval from the vaccine receipt to symptom onset was 13 minutes, so most did fall within the period of time that it's mandatory to wait and be observed. And the disposition of those 21, 20 of them for whom there was a follow-up history available had all recovered. So again, your role as healthcare providers is to recognize, respond, and report anaphylaxis following COVID-19 vaccination to VAERS. That's the passive reporting system that is co-managed by CDC and FDA. It's to report adverse events to VAERS in accordance with the FDA and EUA emergency use authorization reporting requirements. Participate in CDC's VSafe program for yourself and then advocate that to patients, and communicate with your patients about vaccine safety and what we know.
1
So
minute.
moving on now to the ACIP recommendations for vaccine allocation and prioritization. There have been a number of MMWRs published on this issue where you can find all of the details, of which I'm going to give a high-level summary. So you can think of this as the overall, the universe of adults 16 and older in the United States. The dark blue represent phase 1A allocation, and phase 1A doses were allocated to long-term care facility residents, as well as healthcare personnel, described quite broadly as people who work in healthcare, no matter what their role in the healthcare setting is. From there, phase 1B includes frontline essential workers, as well as persons 75 years and older. Phase 1C then is persons 65 to 74, as well as persons 16 to 64 with high-risk medical conditions. Moving on to phase 2, that would be persons 16 to 64 without any high-risk medical conditions. So the phased recommendations were really about trying to balance the goals of prevention of morbidity and mortality with preserving societal functioning. And you can see that throughout the phases that were just enumerated. In terms of essential workers, the frontline essential workers were described as first responders, firefighter, police, people who work in education, teachers, support staff, daycare, persons who work in food and agriculture in our food system, those who work in essential manufacturing, corrections workers, U.S. Postal Service, public transit workers, and grocery store workers. And then the other essential workers are listed to the right. This list essentially is created by an agency called CISA within the Department of Homeland Security, who are the ultimate agency responsible for developing the list of who are essential workers in times of emergency.
Thanks, Dr. Dooley.
Okay. Sorry, did you want me to continue?
30 seconds at most.
Okay, so there are the conditions associated with severe COVID are outlined here. There's a list that is kept by the CDC, and you can find updates to any of those here. So I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Alpa Kisler. Dr. Kisler is the director of the Division of Nephrology and Hypertension and professor of medicine and Catherine McLaughlin Hakim Chair in Vascular Biology at the Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. Alp is also the chair of NTDS's Current and Emerging Threats Work Group and a member of the ASN COVID-19 response team. Alp.
Alan, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here, and it's a pleasure to sort of be a part of this webinar. What I will be talking about is an overview, a short overview, about 10 minutes or so, the clinical trials that are related to COVID vaccines and the allocation priorities. Not much detail, just to give you some relevance to the dialysis patients that we have to take care of. These are my disclosures. I have no relationship to the two companies that actually provide the vaccines, Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna, which I will be referring them by name because of simplicity. So we know that there are two vaccines that are authorized under emergency use right now in the United States, but we should also keep in mind that there are about 236 registered vaccine trials that are going on in the world right now. So this is a big number. This is a number that I think we should be very optimistic about, in addition to the two vaccines that are available. And as you all may know, there's also one additional vaccine that's been approved in the UK about a week ago that is not available in the United States. Just to take a quick look, there are about 12 phase 3 trials that are going on, and I will make a note of one trial that has a specific relevance to the dialysis patient population, about 10 minutes or so, the Novavax trial that is actually designed to include some of the dialysis patients and CKD patients into the phase 2 trial. So again, this is the two vaccine trials that I'm going to be talking about. On the left will be the Pfizer-BioNTech, and on the right, the Moderna trial that has been done under the oversight as well as the support of NIH in the United States. And again, this gives us just overall idea of what the two vaccines actually efficacy, dosing type, and the storage. This is a slide that I took from Dr. Schiller, who was nice enough to give it to me. These are the basic study design for the two trials. On the left will be, throughout the presentation, the BioNTech Pfizer trial data. On the right will be the mRNA 1273 Moderna trial. Obviously, I'm not going to go into this detail here. I'm just going to emphasize the red numbers that I added in these slides. As you can see on the left, for the BioNTech Pfizer trial, there were about 44,000 individuals that were screened, and about 83% efficacy in terms of following up these patients, keeping them in this study, and then providing the data to the FDA. And this was done in a span of about 4 months. The same actual success was also seen in the Moderna trial. As you can see, there were about 30,000 plus individuals that were screened and randomized initially, with about a 95% retention in this study, with 28,000 plus individuals completing this study. I think this should be an optimistic observation for us, so we can show people that such studies that are really, really hard to do, that we've never imagined that could be done, actually are being done. And that should give us some, some more light at the end of the tunnel in terms of being able to access these vaccines for our patient population, dialysis patients. What are the primary and secondary endpoints that were evaluated in these trials? Again, on the left, in the BioNTech Pfizer trial, the primary endpoint was the efficacy of the vaccine against the confirmed COVID-19 with onset at least 7 days after the second dose, who had been without serologic and virological evidence of the disease, and up to 7 days after the second dose. So this is a little bit different than the Moderna trial on the right. Again, the efficacy is based on the preventing the first occurrence of the symptomatic COVID, but this was actually evaluated at least 14 days after the second infection for the individual. So there's a 7-day difference in terms of the two primary outcomes being started. The Pfizer-BioNTech study also had, similar to Moderna trial, had a major secondary endpoint of assessment of efficacy against the severe COVID. These two slides, the figures actually are taken from the publications that were provided to us about a couple of weeks ago. On the left, you can see the unbelievably robust efficacy of the vaccine, the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine. On the right, the same data can be seen for the Moderna trial. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but just to let you know that I'm going to be talking about these data a little bit more so that you have an idea. And I think this is really important in terms of re-emphasizing, because when we talk to our patients or healthcare staff that needs to be informed and educated about these vaccine trials, these are the important points that we need to communicate. The robust efficacy of the vaccines in the general population. And again, on the left, the table shows the vaccine efficacy, both in terms of percentage as well as the number of individuals who actually had the COVID-19 for Pfizer, and then on the right for the Moderna trial. And as you can see, I'm just going to emphasize the red highlighted font over here, the numbers here. The efficacy, the vaccine efficacy, was actually 52% between the two doses. This is important. And again, people have to pay attention to, because a lot of times we sort of lose, let our defend go down once the first vaccination is done. But the vaccine is not as effective between the two vaccine administrations. And again, the same data is very similar, about 50% for the Moderna trial. But if you look at the actual data, 7 days after the second dose for the Pfizer trial and about 14 days after the second dose for the Moderna trial, the actual vaccine efficacy is 94.8% and 94.1%, an unbelievably robust outcome. If you look at any time after randomization, the numbers are even better for the Moderna in terms of comparison to the Pfizer trial, but again, more than 82% for both vaccines. What is the relevance to the dialysis population, which is the benefiting population for us? Actually, there's not much data for us to be able to say anything. In the Pfizer trial, there was about 250 patients with kidney disease included out of the 40,000 individuals, and the other trial did not have any kidney disease patients, as far as we know yet. There may be some here and there, but these data are not really readily generalizable to the dialysis population. But considering the fact that substantial portion of our dialysis patients are elderly, there's about 162,000 patients on dialysis in the United States that are over the age of 65 now. You can make some reflection of the data here. And the most important thing that I would like to say is that if you look at the age groups for both studies, here and here, the efficacy is very robust, more than 86% for Moderna and almost 90% to 100% for the Pfizer trial for elderly people. So this is a really important observation that we can really relate to our dialysis patient population. The safety data has been detailed by Dr. Dooling, so I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll tell you that about 83% of the people will have some pain. But if you look at the last line for both trials, there were no grade 4 adverse events, which is really important. What about the pending questions regarding the vaccines? Well, I think things that we have to take into account, which we need some data when the vaccine is being administered to the general population, is the potential change in the efficacy with inclusion of high-risk individuals. That is, people with older age, as well as people who have some comorbidities. We actually do not know much about the efficacy of the vaccine in high-risk individuals, and most importantly, patients with advanced kidney disease. There's some discussion that's been going on about the use of single dose to be able to include more individuals with number of vaccines that are available versus doing the strict double dose. And again, I have to say CDC has actually made a comment about that they would like to continue with the double dose. But there may be some benefit with the efficacy of the single dose, which we need to see. Obviously, as I mentioned, there are no data available to us to be able to assess the side effect profile as well as the efficacy in the patient population we deal with. But we're always concerned with this idea that immune response is not as robust in dialysis patients. Again, no data other than what I will show you here, the data that's been published for the safety and the immunogenicity of the Moderna vaccine in older adults. And I'm not going to go into detail, but just to let you know that the dose that was used in the actual trial, 100 micrograms, was very effective in the elderly population. That's the only relevance that we can find at this time. And then what are the operational issues that we have to deal with? I think this is one of the most critical aspects of the whole process. This is the slide that I downloaded from the Tennessee website in terms of the vaccine phases. I think this is very well known to everybody. I don't need to go through this, but I will tell you that there will be some minor differences in terms of how it's applied, not only the different states, but also at different county levels. For example, in the state of Tennessee, this additional simultaneous age-based criteria is not the same for every county in the state. This county that I live right now is still at 1A1. Despite that, the rest of the state, almost 95%, is actually vaccinating people older than the age of 75. So this really gives a little bit of a difference in terms of how this is being applied, in addition to what we can see here. I would also like to emphasize the risk that we're dealing with, or the part that we need to be very careful about. As we all know, our patients are right now on phase 1C, and that is listed here. We're actually listed just below cancer as chronic kidney disease. Now, I would like to emphasize 3 bolded bullets here. In the same category as chronic kidney disease, COPD patients are also included. That is 6% of the U.S. population. But more importantly, obesity and severe obesity, BMI greater than 30, is also at the same level of risk as having chronic kidney disease in this allocation and prioritization. That is 40% of the U.S. population. That means that we will have to be competing with almost one out of 2 to be able to get our patients vaccinated. If you add the smoking, that is another 14% of the U.S. population. There may be some overlap with these risk factors, but this is an important problem that we have to take into account. So what do we need to do? We need to actually do initiatives to include dialysis patients, and again, transplant patients as well in this high-risk categories. ASN and other societies has been very active. I've just listed some of the things that we've done here over the last month or 2. we're still actively trying our best to be able to use our capability of education and information for advocacy of our patients, and we will not stop. But this is an important initiative that we have to continue. And again, this is the other thing that I would like to mention. In addition to people that are at risk, there's a list of people that might be at risk for increased risk of COVID on the CDC website. That includes overweight. That is 72% of the US population. How are we going to be able to sort of emphasize and be able to approach to the administrators to say our patients are important, our patients are really, really going to suffer out of this? What can we do? This is my last slide. I think there are also some opportunities. We shouldn't give up, and there's no reason to be a nihilistic approach for this current state. First of all, I would recommend everyone who has any connection to a dialysis unit to identify their patients who are older than 75 years of age. That is more than 162,000 dialysis patients that can be actually vaccinated today in most of the country. And we should go ahead and identify those people, ask them their vaccination preference, and should be able to get them into the system as quickly as possible. We also start simultaneously a unit-based vaccine survey for other patients in terms of who wants to be vaccinated and what the logistics are. Nobody has really thought about the transportation of these patients to vaccine centers. Today, people over the age of 75 who are on dialysis require specific ambulances and other transportation. And how are we going to get these people to the vaccine points? So we need to know, and we will continue the advocacy. And I'd like to finish with a positive note. And again, an enormous work by the Kidney Health Initiative and the ASN collaboration. We have a company now who will be including individuals with chronic kidney disease into their trials going forward. The Novavax trial will actually specifically include CKD patients, where we can have more information that's available to us. With that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Akisler.
Great. So we have Dr. Dooling back with us. We also have Dr. Jeff Himes. Dr. Himes is the Chief Medical Officer for Fresenius Medical Care in the United States. We have Mr. Richard Knight. Mr. Knight is the president of the American Association of Kidney Patients and is himself a kidney transplant recipient. We have Ms. Nancy Colombo-Smith. Ms. Smith is a registered nurse and a member of the American Nephrology Nurses Association, whom she's representing this evening, and has also been very involved in administering COVID-19 vaccines. So we'll be able to talk with us about her experience there. We have Dr. Akisler back with us as well. And I don't think I missed anybody. Good. Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Elizabeth Fortune, who is also a patient representative from the National Kidney Foundation and is with us as well. Okay, so the first question that we have relates to the safety and efficacy of the vaccines in people with chronic kidney disease, those with end-stage kidney disease who are treated by dialysis, and those with kidney transplants. And I know that Dr. Akisler, you reviewed the data from the Pfizer-BioNTech trial as well as the Moderna trial and pointed out that there's really very little data for those patients. Is there anything that either you or Dr. Dooling would like to add?
From my perspective, I think even the fact that the vaccine is extremely safe for the general population, I think we should be probably optimistic that it will be pretty reasonable, at least for the patients with advanced kidney disease. I would assume anyone with earlier stage of kidney disease should not have any specific difference compared to the general population. A transplant is a different story. I would refer to the ASD website, which they actually recommend vaccination of the transplant patients after the first month of the transplantation. Anyone that's beyond 6 months who's stable with no change in immunosuppression should be vaccinated is the recommendation as far as I know, but Dr. Dooling might have some additional information.
Now, Dr. Akisler, I think you summarized it very well. There's still a lot we don't know about the disease itself, and there's still a lot we don't know about the vaccine in certain populations. So I think, the vaccine is definitely recommended in this population. To what extent people will mount an immune response if they have frank immunocompromise, such as in the setting of a transplant, I think remains to be seen. But as people who work in transplant know, to the extent possible, getting vaccination accomplished prior to transplantation or prior to a chemotherapeutic regime, et cetera, has generally worked well with other vaccines, and presumably will be so with this one too.
And would your advice be any different for a patient who's currently on dialysis but is on the transplant waiting list and perhaps anticipating getting a transplant soon, or for patients who are undergoing immune therapy in anticipation of getting IVIG for sensitization in preparation for a transplant?
I don't think we know enough really to fine tune recommendations to that extent. For me as a public health practitioner, it keeps coming back to first principles of using all non-pharmacologic measures to prevent transmission entirely. And then, when the vaccine becomes available, using that as another tool in the armament to protect these patients.
Great.
AST is very clear in terms of people who are waiting for a transplant to get vaccinated. I do not know about the potential for IVIG, and I've never really thought about that, which is a very interesting question. But for ones who are eligible and who are on the list for a transplant should get it is the recommendation from the American Society of Transplantation.
Okay. And then two sort of final questions in this area. One is whether there's any difference between the two vaccines that are currently approved under EUA for these populations. And the second is, what about pediatric patients who either have kidney transplants or who are on dialysis?
I can start. So the two vaccines that have been recommended so far, both mRNA vaccines, if you refer back to the list of ingredients, you will find that they are extremely similar. They performed extremely similarly in terms of their efficacy in the phase 3 trials. They performed extremely similarly in terms of the types of reactions that people experienced in the days following the vaccination. So these are ultimately pretty similar vaccines. The Pfizer vaccine is licensed for people 16 and older right now, and the Moderna vaccine is licensed for 18 and older. They are both actively exploring use in pediatric patients and doing what are called dose de-escalation studies to see what doses are necessary to have the desired effects of protection in children. So although not licensed yet or not authorized yet for those pediatric patients, more is to come and actively being worked on at this time.
Great, thank you. The next questions I'll direct to Dr. Himes and to Dr. Schiller as she has sound. The question generally relates to immunity after vaccination and what we know or how you might assess whether patients respond to the vaccine and for how long their response lasts.
Yeah. So, I think, first of all, I don't believe that we should look at vaccination of dialysis patients as exercise in futility. There may be some blunting of their response, but clearly we get a substantial proportion immunized for hepatitis and pneumonia. There's a little more controversy about influenza, but there are a number of studies showing that those are protective. So I would anticipate that a vaccine that has the high degree of immunogenicity that this one does will likely provide a reasonable degree of protection in our dialysis patients. Now, the analogy, I think, in terms of response is what we do for patients who are immunized for hepatitis. And that is we check for titers at some point afterwards. There are, I believe, 2 assays for neutralizing antibody that corresponds to the spike protein antibody that's produced by both of these vaccines. And at least tentatively, we're planning to look at antibody levels at some point after the second vaccination to get an idea of immunity. But I think that's a reasonably practical approach that we can take, at least initially.
Great, thanks. Dr. Dooling, I'll address this question to you briefly, and then I will turn to our patient representatives. From what Dr. Kisler said about the data from the trials, it sounds like there's no difference in data among different ethnic groups. Do you have any thoughts about the issues that have been raised around the history of mistreatment of people of color by organized medicine and how that might impact the vaccines themselves and acceptance of the vaccine?
So I was not surprised to see that the vaccine's efficacy and safety was similar across race and ethnic groups. I don't think anybody in the vaccinology world expected it to be any different. But you're absolutely right, is where there is a gap, there's a trust gap because of a number of things that you mentioned and frankly, a history of mistreatment among the within medical care. So I think that part of what the vaccine sponsors aim to do through inclusion, making their vaccine trials reflect the population that they hope to administer the vaccine to over time. And now we continue to, I hope, build on that trust and make this vaccine something that everybody wants to get because it's safe and it's effective.
Thank you.
Can I make a comment, Jeffrey? I think this is important. I can only speak for my own practice in the state of Tennessee and the institution that I work. The way we reach out to patients right now is through telehealth, messaging through their, electronic medical records or phone. And unfortunately, as you all know, it was brought up by one of my colleagues that individuals you're talking about, the people with different socioeconomic status, with different backgrounds, they may not have as much access to those tools to be able to schedule themselves for these vaccines. So I think we're dealing with a very important problem here, how to really make sure that the diversity and inclusion of those individuals with underprivileged backgrounds are able to have access to vaccination. And that's something that's really important for our patient population because we have a substantial portion of those. Just wanted to bring that up as well.
Thank you.
And I'd like to say the CDC has a number of provider toolkits, so healthcare providers can look to those as resources to how to have conversations with your patients who may be hesitant.
Thank you. Ms. Fortune, do you have any thoughts regarding your own view of this and what advice you might give to your colleagues?
Not on necessarily this particular subject. I don't I know I speak to it like anecdotally from what I've heard about the history of the mistreatment. I do know that my dialysis clinic, in terms of the staff, I think with the staff, they're kind of split 50-50 on who trusts a government vaccine and who doesn't. But it's just more based on like what I've heard in talking with like my own nurse and that I see and kind of their own views of not getting the vaccine.
Okay, good. Thank you.
And I feel like, go ahead.
No, that's fine. Mr. Knight, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to add and how you might advise your colleagues?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you for allowing me to participate. I'm going to speak to the patients. I think it's very important that we understand education, credibility, and trust. We've had a history, we've had some challenges. And as we look at these vulnerable patients that have a higher probability and exposure to COVID-19, I know as an organization, we've been working since March to educate patients, United States, throughout the world, we've probably hit 100,000 patients in 70 countries. Education is the key so that they understand, first of all, the risk associated with COVID-19, which leads to, if there is a vaccine that is available, what are the risks and what are the benefits? There's a lot of information that we don't know, but what we do know is that for this vulnerable population, minorities in particular, the data doesn't bode well in terms of the percent that choose to take the test. So we need to come up with a message that will encourage people. And quite frankly, at a very high level, the risk of not taking the vaccine are much greater than the benefits that are much less than the benefits that you will receive from taking the vaccine. I mean, we talked about obesity, and generally dialysis patients and certainly transplant patients are going to have other issues. Perhaps obesity seems to be something that's going on, but we must be able to build that bridge, which means that we need to collectively begin messaging. We've worked with KHI to message, to send a bold message that this population needs to be included in clinical trials. But before we get to that point, we have to have some degree of trust. And we need to message that in multiple ways. This webinar, I think, is a great start. AAKP will be doing some webinars, and we'll invite some of you out to participate because we're going to need multiple messages. And when I look at where I live here in Prince George's County, a number of the healthcare providers are hesitant to take the vaccine. That's problematic in terms of how they may be advising the patients. So that's something that we have to deal with. So beyond healthcare, I think that we have a strong leadership challenge because the risk of patients not being vaccinated, our numbers will continue to escalate. And I think people will miss out on something that can really have an impact, not just on their quality of life, but on their ability to continue living. This is very serious. And I think it needs to be given the intention and focus, and we need to do what we can do. We need to make it a priority to make certain that we deal with this patient population, certainly focusing on the minorities, which are disproportionately impacted by, as percentage of the population of being on dialysis. And I think that a good start here, we've got to do more. So thanks for allowing me to respond to that, Jeff.
I appreciate your comments, Richard, and I believe it's actually a perfect segue into Dr. Schiller's talk, because I think that she's going to talk a lot about the disease and the impact that it's had on the community of patients who are on dialysis. So I will ask the panel to turn off their cameras and microphones now, and then Dr. Kleiger, if you want to go ahead and introduce Dr. Schiller, we'll go ahead with her talk.
Thanks, but don't go away, panel. Dr. Brigitte Schiller is the Chief Medical Officer for Satellite Healthcare.
Yes, thank you very much. And I apologize for the difficulties that we had here. I'm in Silicon Valley. I'm not known to be the tech wizard, but it's usually not as grim as this just was. I hope after this rich discussion to still thank you for the opportunity to address some of the real world implications of vaccination in our dialysis patients as we prepare to administer the vaccine in this vulnerable at-risk population. Here are my disclosures. As we heard from Dr. Ikisler and Dr. Dooling, there is now a glimmer of hope to crush the virus as 2 vaccines are now available for distribution. Given the specific requirements, as you see here, for storage of the vaccines, you can easily anticipate some of the infrastructure issues emerging. To ensure successful implementation, there are a number of steps that require attention and preparation. First, there are some logistic issues. There is limited availability of the vaccine as of now that we expect to be less of an issue over the coming month. But right now, with more than 200,000 new cases on a daily basis in the US, the limitation is adding stress to a healthcare system that really requires heroic commitment from its frontline workers for many months now. We'll talk briefly about the distribution of the vaccine across the country and the storage requirements, obviously requiring -70 freezers, which are not routine equipment in all healthcare settings. Adds another complexity. The Pfizer vaccine is stable for 5 days unreconstituted at refrigeration temperatures, but this requires obviously swift alignment of all parties involved once the vaccine arrives. Acceptance of the vaccine has already been brought up in the discussion earlier and will be critical for the success in achieving herd immunity. We're aiming at a rate of 80 to 85% vaccination across the country. We'll touch a bit on the importance of addressing the emotional and belief systems and the barriers that they come with, and certainly the clinical issues in our population with a new vaccine in a vulnerable population is the focus of our efforts. We have mentioned before, you have heard before, that because of the limited availability of the vaccine, there's an allocation algorithm that has been outlined by ACIP. Now, our population is here in the people of high risk for severe COVID illness due to underlying medical conditions, and you've heard that both chronic kidney disease and patients with transplant are competing with a large number of other comorbid diseases. When you look at the real numbers, it outlines here the difficulty or the challenge that we're having. While the healthcare professionals working in dialysis centers fall into the 1A category, this category is comprised of a total of about 24 million people, including long-term care facility residents. Our patients undergoing dialysis then are part of category 1C if you exclude the ones above 75 years old. This group of more than 100 million people. So some of our patients may receive the vaccine because they're long-term facility residents. Others will receive it because they're older than 75 years old, as pointed out before. However, pausing for a moment on these big numbers to be treated, we easily recognize of what incredible task we have at hand here. And the expectation of the public is high, and the available numbers and logistics are unlikely to fulfill the needs in an expected timely manner, as we find out now. Another difficulty for us is obviously, as pointed out by Dr. Kisler before, that we have a very small number of patients with renal disease here from the Pfizer study, a total of 123, requiring a scarcity of data with respect to the vaccine efficacy and safety. And obviously our patients will ask for data and for our assessment of the data. There's no data in patients with kidney transplant at this, so most medical recommendations are made with full transparency, but in the presence of scarcity of data, obviously our clinical judgment and for risk-benefit ratio assessment during the pandemic will require communications with our patient based on trust. Let's move on what we actually know as of now about the distribution of the vaccine at this time. It is unlikely that I can give you the answers that you're searching for, you were hoping for, because the answer to your question, what about distribution, is it depends on where you live. It depends on which state you're living in, and then it depends on which county you're living in. We in California have 58 counties, and so we have potentially 58 different solutions or opportunities to sign up for this vaccine. While some might be similar, not all of them are. It cannot be overstated that this problem then, to work through this, is what we're asked to do. It adds burden to everybody in the process, but I also would like the audience to know that everybody on the different levels of this process is trying their very best, as everybody understands the urgency of this success. But it's really complicated, is the best way to express some of the realities that we're facing on a daily basis. We do have some data, however, to show off where it's actually going within the United States. This is from the CDC website, the COVID vaccination tracker, with data as of January 2nd. And these data were mentioned before by Dr. Dooling. We have more than 12 million more than 13 million distributed, more than 4 million vaccine doses have been administered up until January 2nd. In the long-term facilities, as you can see here on the lower left side, more than 2 million are distributed and close to 300,000 are administered. Clearly, there are issues on getting them to the patients where they need to go, to the healthcare workers as well. But these are difficulties that are logistic and that need to be worked through. And we hope that the acceleration of this process will improve over the coming weeks. When you look at the map on the right side, you see that the states have a varying total numbers of people having received their first dose. The dark blue states may be a reflection of lower population density and thus lower supply needs, which may have been met faster. Let's look a little bit at the vaccination acceptance as already touched on in the discussion before. The goal is herd immunity, and we will need to convince the skeptics to get the vaccine. Now, skeptics with respect to vaccine have always existed, and it is a spectrum. There are the early adopters on the right side who accept the vaccines, and they're the ones who are refusing all the time. But the vast majority is really in that middle and can be convinced and talked to, educated, as Mr. Knight said so clearly. We have also data from the United States of that the acceptance has actually changed throughout the pandemic. In May, about 70% of Americans would accept a vaccine. That number was down by September to 51%. There is clearly a messaging and a politicization of this real healthcare and science issue. However, we're back to 60% in November of this year. And the good news really is here in those lower green circles. Out of those 40% who say they would not get the vaccine, half of them are actually able to be convinced, as they say, they might possibly get the vaccine. And I think this is where we have our opportunity and where we can improve the vaccination acceptance. So what are some of the reasons why people don't want to get vaccinated? I think there's three categories. One is the category of denial or lack of understanding. People with a sense of invulnerability, often the young among us, lack of understanding that this vaccine is not only for us as a personal protection, but really also to end a societal threat that harms us as a communities, both health-wise and with the subsequent economic and long-term consequences we have been living now for several months. There's a trust issue and transparency issue, and Tuskegee is one of those reasons, historical events for this lack of trust that we need to overcome. And there's also conspiracy theories that, this may now be, warnings are out that the vaccine might be able to make us all traceable. So the mistrust is real, and we need to acknowledge it and undo it. There's also fear about pharma in general. There is concern, as often is, with genetic manipulation of a potential vaccine, especially because there are new technologies used right now. There's also some concern that this was developed too fast, when in fact, I think we all as a scientific clinical community embrace the enormous success that has been made possible through a concerted effort and resources put behind worldwide need. And then there's obviously always the concern about adverse events. So how do we educate patients? With education by telling purpose and context. But I fully agree with Mr. Knight that this really calls for leadership. Leadership for us to bring the facts and evidence and the data out. Also to lead by example. What will we do as frontline workers or wherever we are in the range of this allocation of the vaccine? The NKF and many other websites and professional societies have made it very clear in writing and through educational materials that the risk of getting the disease for anybody with kidney disease is much bigger than what we know right now about getting the vaccine. And with more than 4 million people now having gotten the vaccine, I think we also can get more confidence that even though we lack data in our patient population, that with such a fast rollout, we would see immediate bad events by now. There is then the traditional alternative communications, and I would tell you that having been introduced by my teenage son to TikTok, that social media indeed has a lot of downsides, but it has also a lot of upswings. And the short and poignant and scientific sound short videos on those kind of social media websites have been very useful, and I can tell you that we have decided to even use this within our organization, in addition to all the professional brochures, videos, and documents that are available on CDC website or any others professional patient advocacy authorities. And you might even want to go and talk about this is not the time to throw away our shot, and this is certainly a week where Hamilton might come in even beyond the healthcare shot. Many healthcare organizations have brought up leading by example. If physicians whom we trust, the foundation of our healthcare is the trust to the physician who prescribes, this gives a glimmer of hope when we see our own physicians and we're taking pictures of every medical director in every center and distribute it with our staff and the patients to see that they were there when the frontline healthcare people actually got access to it. So all of these interventions should hopefully help with this. But then what are our clinical considerations? Well, we need really to understand how to do this. We need an order from the nephrologist, and I'm giving you here the recommendations and plans that we have developed in our organization as a nonprofit dialysis provider. We will use the fact sheet for recipients and caretakers prior to vaccination and distribute to all of our patients, plan to distribute once we get the vaccine. We have determined that no other vaccine should be given while we're immunizing our patients with COVID-19 vaccine within 14 days prior to the first vaccination up until 14 days after the second vaccination. Obviously, contraindications have been reviewed before. Severe anaphylaxis in the past to a prior dose of COVID, obviously, or any of the components of the vaccine are contraindications. Severe allergic reactions to other injectable medications, we will need to make a decision to not vaccinate. And then moderate or severe acute illness during the time, we will wait for them. Given the data on the 90-day low risk of reinfection, for now we will hold for 90 days after acute diagnosis, but obviously as more vaccines become available, this may change. But for now, given the shortage of the vaccine, this will be our approach. We will give it to patients while they undergo hemodialysis, and home dialysis patients will receive it during their monthly visit. We plan on giving it to the patients when we have at least 30 minutes prior to the patient leaving the dialysis center or the home dialysis facility. We're planning to do this in the second half of the hemodialysis treatment to also align with heparin. We have experience from the flu vaccine, which is given on dialysis, where heparin has been continuously given, so that we expect not to have harm by patients, even though it is an IM injection, however, with a small volume. Center patients will be monitored and obviously document for any systemic reactions or adverse responses during those 30 minutes through vital signs, and heparin prescription is unchanged. We have made an effort to really understand that anaphylaxis is the fear, and it's also what we need to be prepared for. Hence, we reviewed all the medication on the crash carts to make sure that EpiPen, IV Benadryl, as well as Solumetrol are there. We reviewed our protocol and procedure for anaphylaxis with all staff prior to any vaccine going into any of the centers. We also recommend the patients to be given 650 milligram once on the day of administration of the vaccine in the centers, and we advise them then according to their own well-being, how they feel, to take up to 650 milligrams 3 times a day for the next 48 hours to decrease potential side effects as described before. Of course, there will be caution in patients with underlying liver disease, and we assume that many of the patients will not need any medication. We look at the report of adverse events not just as a reporting issue, but really for us to understand better how we can advise our patients. And so obviously hope that we'll be successful to report those within 24 hours after immunization. So then the big question is also, how long will our patients be immune against this disease? We know that there is both a cellular, which we cannot monitor, as well as, at least not in routine medicine, as well as antibody production, as illustrated here. Lots of laboratories around the country have now the capability for a variety of antibody measurements, and we will take advantage of this. There is some data out from Belgium, published last month, 2 months ago, where neutralizing antibodies actually have been seen in ESRD patients. However, they're declining in their frequency, in their titers over the next 4 months. So the real question for us will be, as we don't know how fast we can crush this pandemic, if potential reimmunization later on might be necessary, and measuring of antibodies will give us a good guideline to identify patients who are immune and not, aligned with how we do it potentially right now as routine care for hepatitis vaccination.
30 seconds, Brigitte.
Yes, antibodies are usually arriving within 2 weeks, both IgG and IgM, as outlined here in this study. So this brings me actually to the end. I think these are very unusual times. I want to quote the national doctor, Dr. Fauci. This is the time for all of us in healthcare to lead by example and to care selflessly about one another. And yes, the availability of these vaccines, as slow as it is right now, is the way for us to end this thing and crush the virus. With this, thank you for all your work.
Thank you, Brigitte. We want to show a brief video that Mr. Robert Cody made. Mr. Cody is a retired college administrator who currently dialyzes and is a patient advocate for satellite healthcare in Memphis.
Good afternoon. I'm Robert Cody. I am a 75-year-old retired college administrator, married for 52 years and yet counting, with 3 adult children and 3 wonderful grandchildren. I taught school for 1 year, worked for the Indiana Civil Rights Commission 1 year, and worked at 3 universities for a period of 42 years within the divisions of student affairs. I retired in 2012. However, I became a kidney dialysis patient in May of 2010. I received a transplant in August of 2016. However, I returned to dialysis around August or September of 2017. When I read dialysis patients were at high risk for the virus, I began asking questions. September 25th, our satellite health center was featured on the front page of the Memphis Commercial Appeal newspaper. And the title of the article was Virus Stalking Dialysis Patients. That, I believe, was a point in time when I began asking questions of the nurses and staff. Wanted to know if and when the vaccine virus became available, when would we receive the vaccine? I also ask questions such as, do you plan to take the vaccine? I consider the staff being at high risk with 2 and 3 shifts of patients coming in, and then their own local environment away from the center. I consider the patients to be at risk because of their involvement in the center as well as at home and whatever they do away from the center. I truly believe that the vaccine is worthwhile. I do not believe that it was hastily developed. Researchers have studied viruses and epidemics for a long time, for many, many years. SARS, Ebola, HIV, and influenza. It's my opinion that it's unfortunate that we, as a country and nation, did not respond more rapidly. With regard to what people in my community have to say about this, or the skepticism, I don't have much contact with anyone else from the center other than my family. And we limit that to my wife and myself, talking with relatives by phone. I attend church by phone. So my contact is very limited. I have managed to ask staff and a few patients how they felt about the vaccine. I found 2 staff members who said, yes, they plan to take the vaccine. Others, I received a no answer, or I need more information, waiting to see that this thing really works. With regard to the CKD community and leaders and what can be done to reduce the resistance with the kidney care community toward the vaccine, I say you required the mask, require the vaccine. Both staff and patients alike should be required to take the vaccine. Flu shots are required. Pneumonia shots are required. And we need to do this with the vaccine. Thank you.
If I could ask the panel to turn back on their microphones and their videos, we'll get back to the Q&A. We don't have a whole lot of time left, so I will get to as many questions as I can, and I apologize in advance that we're not able to get to more. Mr. Knight, I'm going to direct the first question to you, which is in addressing patient questions, what information is it important for staff to, and for nephrologists to be able to give patients?
Well, first of all, I think your posture is important. we have to have a degree of confidence that we're acting on the best interest of the patient. And again, we mentioned it earlier that there's risk, but we think that the benefits are going to greatly outweigh them. We've asked a lot of questions tonight. A lot of questions have been asked that we don't have answers to. And I think that you can be honest with the patients about that. But we do know that without taking the vaccine, that they certainly are at greater risk. And as you get information, you will let them know. And I would say this, the large numbers that we talk about, forget about it. Each state, each county gets an allocation, and really the supply right now isn't relevant. The distribution and how we're rolling this out to the patients, everyone that's getting this, is important. And we have to improve that. I believe that patients at dialysis facilities perhaps should be taken care of by the facilities. The doctor mentioned the process they have out at Satellite, which makes sense. And I think different facilities, you're at Robeson, I know that you guys will have a tremendous plan. But I think that it's important that we educate the staff, the nurses, the techs, everyone. Even if they don't believe it themselves, they need to talk about it from a patient perspective of what's going to be in the best interest of the patient. And I think that's, kind of a strategy that needs to be developed. And the staff needs to understand that this isn't a time for them to freelance and give their own personal opinion, because they're not patients. So I'll let someone else chime in. But again, leadership, establish a policy, be consistent, and be honest.
I appreciate that. Ms. Fortune, let me direct the same question to you. What information would you want to hear if you were sitting on the fence about whether to take the vaccine or not from your staff and your nurses and your physicians?
If I were on the fence, which I'm not, my doctor and I have, as Mr. and I have talked about the risks and the benefits, and my doctor and I have made that decision together. But I think that the most important thing, knowing what my monthly visits are in the clinic, is obviously from my nurse, but also from the social worker, because the social worker in my clinic, every month she has an educational topic for the month, and we don't always spend a lot of time face-to-face talking about that topic, but she's got handouts, she has websites, she has links, she has information that she can point me to so that I can get more information. And I think that the social workers need to be involved in that also, because they do more, at least in my clinic, they do more of that one-on-one educational than the nurses do. And I think sometimes even having a handout, because there was a subject a couple of months ago that my social worker had talked to me before, and just to talk about it, it didn't really click in my mind. But as soon as she gave me some handouts, I was like, whoa, this totally makes sense. I completely understand this. So, I think understanding that, maybe some people can take the information in once they hear it, but maybe other people need to sit down, read it, process it. So that's kind of like what I would recommend, or what I think I would like to see from the clinics, is really utilizing like the social workers and knowing that like they have monthly topics. And again, in my clinic, I have to sign off every month that I received that educational topic. And I think making the vaccine, and to Mr. Knight's point too, even if maybe the person personally doesn't want the vaccine or believe in it, they still need to educate their patients. And so I think just being able to say, here's some information on the vaccine. This is from the CDC. This is from NKF. This is from whoever. That helps the patient make a more informed decision. And then if they still have questions, then they can come to their doctor and say, hey, I was looking over this. Can you help me weigh the risks and the benefits?
I think that's very important what you're saying, which is that the information needs to come from the entire medical team, not just from one member of the team. Ms. Smith, do you want to address that from the nursing perspective as well, and what some of your colleagues who may be hesitant might want to hear?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what Mr. Knight and Ms. Fortune said is very true. We need to do our research, but also as leadership, we need to share what we know. We need to make this easily transparent and reachable accessible to everyone. To share nurses that I had the vaccine, tell them what we've shown, show them the data. As I was sharing with some of you, I've been helping out in the vaccine clinic for these last several weeks. We gave 10,000 vaccines by New Year's. And I've seen people's reactions. It was very much as described: sore arms, some lymph node swelling, but really overall it was very well tolerated. People were very excited. And they were taking a lot of pictures to share with their friends and families to make them feel secure, because it's about us as healthcare providers, as people, but also about our communities and the people that care about us and that we care about. So it's all of that together.
And if I might ask you a related question about having been working in the vaccine clinic, are you aware of any patients that have been vaccinated who have kidney disease, and were their reactions any different from the other people without kidney disease?
At this time, we've been mostly focusing on healthcare workers, medics and fire, so not that I know of specifically.
Okay, great, thank you. And then I know we only have a minute or two. Let me ask this to Dr. Himes and Dr. Schiller. Dr. Schiller, you mentioned about home dialysis patients, and I guess the question really is, are there differences in how we might approach vaccinating home patients versus in-center patients? And particularly a question came up about the caregivers, particularly for home patients.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I know the answer to that, Jeff. I think we can say that home dialysis patients, given our data we have right now, have a lower risk than the patients who are going to center, most likely due to the fact that of exposure to many more risk interventions potentially of being exposed to people with the virus. We have not discussed that we would give it later to home dialysis patients. We're still waiting for the allocation, and we'll then give it to everybody who is willing to get it. I think it's a good idea to give it to the caregivers at the same time. The numbers and the availability will make the decision on that.
Thank you. And Dr. Himes, any further comments?
Yeah, well, I think that there is a lower observed case rate in the home patients, but of course, the home patients are not in an environment where they get asked about symptoms and tested 12 times, they have the opportunity for testing 12 times a month. So I think there probably is some benefit from not being traveling around and potentially exposed. I think some of it also is just opportunity to be investigated. We think it's equally important, though, to vaccinate our home patients, and certainly we will get the allocation. I've seen some preliminary communication about whether or not we as a dialysis provider could vaccinate the caregivers, and apparently there is some distinction there between a home caregiver family member and an employed caregiver. So that still has to be clarified. I'll just, if I may take advantage of I just want people to know how hard the dialysis organizations are trying to get the vaccine. I do believe that an opportunity was missed, given that the dialysis organizations have nurses, facilities, experience in giving vaccination, and a highly, highly vulnerable population, by not directly allocating vaccines to the dialysis providers. That being said, there have been very, very constructive conversations with HHS and CDC, and I think as the supply improves, we're potentially going to see the ability of these organizations to get and distribute vaccine.
And I'm glad you're mentioning this.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Dr. Shaw.
Sorry, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned this, Jeff, because I do believe that there is hope that it's still coming to the centers fairly soon.
I was going to say, it's my understanding as well that there's reason to hope that during the month of January, dialysis centers will have vaccine to begin administering. I know that in some states, I've heard that vaccines already are in some of the dialysis clinics.
Yeah.
So go ahead, please.
Yeah, this is, as someone said, very much a county by county, state by state. And as we've reached out to all of the counties and all of the states, we've had some good success in some areas. For example, Louisiana has been very forthcoming. California and some of the counties has done so. Massachusetts is working on it. Maine is working on it. So we are in localities getting good responses.
So I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our presenters this evening. We so greatly appreciate the information that you've shared with us. And we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you on getting information and vaccines to all of our patients and healthcare workers. I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in this evening. On behalf of the American Society of Nephrology and its partners in this webinar, I'm Jeff Silberzweig. Thank you for joining us.